Hi, I'm James Mulvaney. In this video, I'm going to answer the question, if you're a musician or a band, should you be using podcasts as a way to grow your audience and promote yourself? All of that coming right up. Hey, if you're new to this channel, my name is James and I'm an audio entrepreneur working on various different projects, including radio.co, podcast.co and matchmaker.fm, all helping people get great results within the audio, radio and podcasting spaces. So if you are a musician, perhaps you're in a band or you're trying to launch a singing career, then podcasts are a fantastic medium to help you share your messages, tell your stories, and really spread your word and grow that all-important loyal fan base, a loyal audience. But where to start? How do you begin podcasting? And should you start your own podcast or should you be a guest on other people's podcasts? Well, recently I had a chat with Craig Thorn, who's been a musician for over 10 years. He now runs 3 different YouTube channels and he is a podcast host as well. And I spoke to him about the benefits of engaging with podcasts and using them as a tool specifically within the music business or the music industry. So here's the interview. I encourage you to watch to the end. Craig provided some fantastic insight into what it's like being a musician in the podcasting space. So if you're a musician looking to get into podcasting, you're going to find this really, really useful. Hey Craig, welcome along. Let's kick things off. If you want to firstly introduce yourself, tell us who you are, tell us what you do.
Yes, sir. Well, my name is Craig. I go by C. I am an MC. I make music. Among other things, I also own a social media agency and I run a craft beer podcast. I am based in Montreal, Quebec. I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I've been out here almost 11 years. It's keeping all of it's keeping me pretty busy.
Yeah, sounds good. And what so kind of tell me about your music career. Like, how did you get involved in that, and how long have you been involved with music?
I've been doing it since about 2001, 2002. Sort of always in groups. Releasing a whole bunch of stuff in the 2000s. In group format. We got a small distribution deal with a label in Miami. I think it was in 2009, and that inspired us to move to Toronto to be based in North America. Moving to the States is basically impossible. Right. It's super difficult. So we thought, and I'd already lived in Toronto in 2004 for a year, so I knew people, knew how it worked. And there was a reciprocal agreement with Canada, just like they have with the UK as well. So we based ourselves in Toronto. I moved out to Montreal after that, but the music has always just been something that I have been doing. I went solo in 2011. I was in a group and a singer moved over with me and then she decided to leave. So it's been moving pretty nice ever since then. We run our own little boutique label called The Movement Fam with my brother. He goes by Notion. He's a producer and audio engineer and also a rapper. So between the two of us, and I handle obviously like the marketing agency. So between the both of us, and also my partner, Tiffany, she also co-owns everything with me. So she's really great with the marketing stuff too. So between us all, we can do photo, video, music, editing, marketing, everything that we need to kind of do. So it's unfortunately with music, it more takes a back seat to real life stuff. Everything else I do takes up so much more time than the music, but this is good timing right now. We just shot a video on Saturday, the first video for my new album that we've been working on for like 6 years. So it's all, it keeps starting to get more back into it heavily. It's always there, but it's kind of plodding along. Now it's like we're going, full steam ahead, which is great.
That sounds awesome. I'm really glad to hear that. Do you think that's really important that musicians should kind of gain a more wider kind of media skill set? Before we get on to talk about podcasting specifically, I think it was really interesting. You touched on the fact that you kind of, you could do marketing, you could do kind of promo materials, editing audio, obviously editing video, etc. Is that kind of becoming more and more common in the music industry, where musicians themselves are sort of tasked with a lot more responsibility than perhaps like 10 or 20 years ago?
Absolutely. Great point. It's exactly what it is. I don't think I've heard people say you can't survive if you're just a musician. You're not going to survive. There's no way. You have to be able to do other things. So say my brother always started as being a producer and a rapper. So that's, a vocalist, but then you can also use that skill set. I didn't have, I played guitar and stuff, but I wasn't really, super inclined like that. So having that marketing and business, that is a key thing. Like if we're independent, someone has to do it. And otherwise we got to pay someone to do it. But if I can do it, my brother can handle the music side, I can do this side. I feel like that's the bare minimum. Bare minimum is like 2 or 3 other skill sets, and not even just that, graphic designer, video editor, you pretty much should be able to be mostly self-sufficient with the videos. Like I don't think it's feasible for the amount of money that musicians can make these days to only try and just say, yes, I'm just a musician, because that's like 0.0001% of people are making a living doing that. So if you want to make music a part of things, you do have to have other skills. I think it's not even a question anymore.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So let's talk about podcasting. Obviously, you're a member of matchmaker.fm, which is great.
Yes, sir.
So how many podcasts have you been on so far, and kind of what results have you seen by being on them?
So I'm in more of a unique case because I have so much going on and I'm already hosting. I run 2 podcasts. Right. I've sort of been having guests on my podcast. I've probably only done maybe 3 to 5. And it's mostly because I can barely, right now things are a little wild and there isn't enough time in the day. But the ones that I have been on have been great because I feel like podcasts are perfect because they're long form. I was thinking about this just before, and I'm like, well, podcasts are the new version of, we used to chase college radio and try and get on all the college radio stations. Here in Canada, in Australia, they were they weren't called college, but they were just kind of like the independent radio stations. Yeah. And that was what we wanted. But those interviews are like clips of like maybe 5 minutes tops. Whereas like podcasts, you could talk for 2 hours and you can cuss and be yourself and you can extrapolate on longer thoughts. And to me, I'm a long form guy. So podcasts, that's why I like hosting them. So I love going on podcasts. There's nothing, I love it. It's my favorite because people can get to know you on a much deeper level. And I think with music, everything's very face value, right? Everything is like, look at that photo, look at this 15-second video, like all of these different things on social media. People probably, but back in the day, watching your music video, they'll invest 3 to 5 minutes, but now they'll invest 15 to 60 seconds to watch something about you. So no one gets to know anything about artists anymore. And because there's so many artists and so much noise. So podcasts, I think, are the best way around that. You're able to like really get deep with somebody and have a much more in-depth conversation about who you are, what you're about, and even just moving on from just talking about yourself, because that does get boring. The best podcasts, if we just start like going back and forth and just conversing, like that's the best piece of content to me. And I feel like if you're able to, maybe you mentioned something about being sort of like trained as well. Like a lot of artists, sometimes I see them on radio shows when back in the day, and people were like mad awkward and not really talking too much. So with podcasts, I feel like if you're a conversationalist, you're gonna shine, and and people are gonna get to know you and be more interested in your music, because the way that you talk and the way that you present yourself is so much more interesting. I love it. I think it's the greatest.
And why do you think musicians should guest on podcasts then as a tool of promoting their music? Essentially, for the reason I just said, because I feel like people can get to know you so much more. Like I think, and because of that, you're sort of promoting the music without directly promoting it. Yes, you're going, like we had our hip hop podcast last night, and I had one of my good friends on who actually produced my new album. He's a rapper and a producer and an engineer too. So he was releasing his new project. So he came on our podcast to talk about it. And maybe the first part we did an interview and talked about how he, just all of his music stuff. And then we did a decent chunk about the new project, but then he co-hosted the rest of the podcast where we talked about new music and news, culture news and stuff. But then people would have left that 2-hour conversation and be like, he's a cool guy. Like, I want to check out his album. And I think that is the value. That's the true value at the end of doing a longer form podcast. Is just people get to know you, and they'll know pretty quickly if they want to see how you think and be like, well, and then they approach your music differently. If they're like, oh, that person's pretty cool. Yeah. Then they'll be like, oh, well, now I understand more about them when I listen to their music, because sometimes that's the disconnect. We don't know anything about the artist anymore because it's understanding what's going on behind the music and the story of the music, as well as actually being able to appreciate the music itself, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I feel like, aren't you more connected to the artists that you really love if you know a little bit about them? Well, they went through this, and all of their story, whatever that might be, or understand their political views or something like that, something that informs you of their who they are and what their motivations are, and then that shines through in the music. Maybe some of them are just artists and they're just like super creative and weird, which is cool too. But just like, so you can understand them. I think I can't think of another medium that allows people to understand artists more than podcasts. I think podcasts are the greatest thing in the world.
Awesome.
For sure.
That's great. What a soundbite. And also, Can you tell us about? So you mentioned you actually host 2 podcasts as well.
Yes, sir.
So what are they? And can you give us a bit of a background? When did you start them? How long have you been doing them? And what are they? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I started one called BAOS Podcast. It's called Beer and Other Shit is the name of it. It was my stupid little blog. I started this thing in 2011 when I first moved to Canada, my first winter, and all my people in Australia were doing this thing called 365 days of beer, where you have to say, hold the beer and then take a selfie with it, and then you post that, and you had to get 365 in a year. And I'm like, well, obviously there's not 365 beers in existence, so this would be pointless but fun. So with my roommate at the time, we were just getting all the beers we could and just drinking and documenting, and people were like, hey, you should write what you think about it. I'm like, all right, cool. So I started writing just a sentence about it. I knew nothing about beer, so I'm just like, cool. And then I kept that going. I hit 365 in like 7 months, so I was like, oh, okay. And I kept going. I hit 1,000 in like a year and a half, and I just kept going. I'm at like almost 6,500 now. I just kept it going. So that was 2011. So in 2015, I'm doing it. People have said to me, oh, you should write a book with all the reviews or something. I'm like, they're kind of dumb. I'm just like saying ridiculous things. I don't know anything. Yeah. So I wasn't too interested. My girlfriend was like, you should find beer podcasts. And I'm like, good idea. And I looked, and all I could find were these like middle-aged dudes, talking in low tones about malts and pale ales. And it was just so boring. I'm like, this is not for me. And then she was like, well, why don't you start a podcast? So I was like, you know what? I'd love to. So I asked my old roommate. I had since moved to Montreal. He was in Toronto. Yeah. But because I'm a musician, I have all the equipment, I have the knowledge, and I understand audio. Yeah. So he agreed. He came up to Montreal. We recorded batches of 5 episodes at a time. And, I just named it after my old blog because it was literally, I synced all of my content from Instagram, which were beer reviews and just anything else, to Tumblr. That's why hence Beer and Other Shit, because I was being lazy with the name. So I just called it that. Didn't care. Music stressed me out a lot. So this was a nice way to get around it. And then it just started to work. Breweries started reaching out to want to be on it. And then one brewery told us, they were like, well, you are swearing too much and the name has cussing in it. So I don't know if we can be on it. So then we came to a crossroads and we're like, well, we can change the name and clean it up and be serious, or we can say bugger it and keep cussing. But we chose the former. So we changed it to BAOS Podcast. So it still stands for the same thing. Yeah. Trademarked everything now. We've been operating. So my friend since left. I'm the only host. But yeah, we've literally traveled the world, interviewed breweries all across the US. We've interviewed master brewers from Europe and Australia, been back home. We work with tourism offices and do vlogs. It's gone to a YouTube channel as well.
Oh, wow.
And social media. I think I'm little boost potential. I think we're the biggest craft beer podcast in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. I might be boosting. But yeah, it's really great. Interview a lot of people. Through the pandemic, we've obviously traveling has stopped, but we go live on YouTube every Friday, sometimes Thursdays as well as bonus episodes. It's been a beautiful thing. Managing the beer belly has probably been the worst part of it. The volume of beer that comes in, because I have to review stuff for Instagram and all of these things, and that's the problem, because I have more of a pressure to drink. But that podcast has brought me more joy than I ever thought, because I get to tell the stories of the people behind the beer.
Do you also get, without going to details, is it commercially viable as well? I guess, has it been a good kind of supplementary income stream to your music?
Not as much as what I would like, but it's definitely generated some income with what sponsors right now.
That's good.
We do sponsored posts, and the tourism offices would either pay us or at least pay for the trips, and some of them were quite awesome. Large.
Yeah,
man.
To go away for free, why? Brilliant.
Right, because we were paying for it, and it was, think about a trip. Some of the trip might cost us thousands of dollars to go to New York or to go to LA or something for a couple of weeks, maybe even $5,000 to $10,000 sometimes out of pocket that we were paying. And then we realized, we did a California trip in 2017. We're like, this is ridiculous. We can't keep doing this. And we decided to start to tap into the tourism office angle. Don't copy me, guys, because it's the plug. Because my girlfriend also has a wine and spirits and coffee platform. So between that, we cover all things liquid, and she's even got more followers than us. So we combine those, and then we pitch to tourism offices, and they just send us to, between us, we have all the cameras, and we can vlog, and then we do podcasts. So we just create content that through those trips. So
great.
that's been fantastic. And the second podcast, we only started it a year ago. It's called Bad Habits. It was with my brother Notion and my girlfriend's cousin Dan, who from England actually. He moved from Milton Keynes. He moved here last year, and he's trying to stay in Canada. He works for our social media agency, so I brought him in on the podcast. He's been great because he's 23, so he's got this youthful energy, and we focus on hip hop culture. I wanted to talk about music again, and kind of almost what you were saying earlier about what are the value from musicians appearing on podcasts. Well, I was thinking that and trying to ramp that up a bit, and like, what's the value of a musician starting a podcast? And there were two musicians talking about stuff, so people would, for all the reasons I said, see the personality, understand more about who we are, and whether you'll either like us or you won't. We can promote other people's stuff that we like. We try not to focus on guests as much as we focus on ourselves and created our thing, but we have guests here and there. And that's been really fun. We do that every Monday. It's Tuesday now, so we do that every Monday. And Let's Live on YouTube, so we have a video component, and we drop the audio, which we release afterwards. And that's been a really fun thing as well, to just listen to new music, hang out with my brother, an excuse because he's in Toronto, so it's all over video.
Yeah.
And that's been a really fun thing as well, to kind of break it up, to bring music back to the forefront, and it's made me focus more on music again, which is great.
Has it kind of been a double-edged benefit in terms of, like, obviously you've got your audience who follow you for the beer aspect. Do they also listen to your music as well? Yes,
strangely enough, and that was my point, and I didn't think it would convert.
Yeah.
So it did, and funnily enough, I did I did a song in 2014 on my first solo album called Brewheads, which was after my friend's clothing brand, but it's about craft beer. And I couldn't find any other songs that were about, there's lots of drinking songs, but nothing about nerdy craft beer stuff. So I'm pretty sure it was like one of, or if not the first craft beer song. That's our theme song for the podcast.
Yeah.
And because people were following me on Instagram for the reviews, which I split it out last year, and I made a new account just for the reviews because I felt it was too confusing for the music. So I'm getting the beer people coming to my Instagram, and then they're watching me post the music stuff, and then they start sharing the music stuff. And I've incorporated beer in the music videos and things like that. So yes, it absolutely has crossed over, and I'm super happy that actually worked.
I think from what you've just described to me, it sounds like it's kind of like building like you've almost created like a lifestyle brand, which is kind of with you at the center of it in a kind of a cool way. So you're sharing your passion for music, you're sharing your passion for beer, and obviously a lot of the people who follow one or the other will have those kind of cross applicable interests, which I think is perfect when it comes to building any online presence. Really, if you're building a business online, or if you're trying to create a community or an Instagram following or whatever it might be, just having that kind of understanding of who your audience are is really crucial, I think.
That's a really great point. And to even add to that, for the social media agency, we started a YouTube channel about 2.5 years ago, and that's been really going nuts. So I'm sort of the front facing, and our whole point as well, to be honest, is to start a podcast. But we want to start a podcast when we have a larger built-in audience. So we've got just subscribe, and we're almost at 20,000 subscribers, which is pretty decent on YouTube. It's a lot of grinding to get to that, but that drives bits. And then it's interesting because my brother's music is the theme song for that YouTube channel, and then that drives revenue streams from the YouTube. And then the idea is that we'll be able to, because they're short form 10 to 20 minute videos, things like that, we want to be able to take that to the podcast level, to be able to tell entrepreneurial stories in long form and sort of let loose a little bit and have those longer conversations that YouTube doesn't allow for. So there's that builds into everything. It doesn't complement the other two, the music and the beer kind of cross over a little bit more. I don't think people who follow us for social media will really care too much about that, but it's still another part to that overall brand. And I guess that was sort of, like you said, the lifestyle brand wasn't really the intention, but it was probably the unintentional result of all of this, all of the interest. Just, hey, there's probably other people like me who like craft beer and hip hop, and maybe even some who actually care about social media or marketing, entrepreneurial pursuits. So it's sort of what they say, if with niches, if you try to talk to everyone, you talk to no one. So it's pretty niche, and hopefully that will continue. And I think it's all just been consistency over time to just grow it. And
consistency, absolutely, is always important. I think it seems like you've found you've kind of found your what's the word I'm looking for? Tribe. you found your tribe, basically. That's what they call it, isn't it? In kind of marketing terms, it's like
100%.
It's people who are kind of all share similar interests. Some people might be more into music, some people might be more into the beer aspect, but ultimately it's like it's being specific about who you're kind of going after. So what would you give as advice to someone who's maybe they're an up and coming artist, or they're interested in going into the music business? Is a podcast something that people should be considering straight away, or should they be focusing on other things? What advice would you give to someone who's kind of brand new to it? They've just started to create music and they're thinking, this could be a nice little side hustle for me, or this is something that eventually I'd like to do full time. Is it something that I should be thinking about straight away, either being a podcaster myself or being a guest on other people's podcasts? What's your take on that?
That's a really great question. As you're asking it, I think I can't see any reason to not move on it immediately. So if you're an artist and you just discovering your interest and talents in music, why wouldn't you start a podcast as well? Because what we've done, we've been doing music for so long, but we only started a podcast a year ago. Like if we had that depth of episodes and maybe more of stuff out there, maybe people that would be further along, and the podcast is going to further your musical pursuit. So I would say, if you're starting out, grab a couple co-hosts, showcase who you are and give people an additional reason to follow you. There's a million, say, or whatever genre you're in, there's a million of it. There's a million bands, there's a million rappers, a million singers. It's, there's more competition than ever. The chances of making it are lower than ever, but maybe they're kind of higher because the barriers to entry are lower. So you have to differentiate and target that niche. So if you're, there's one dude I know who's doing really well, and he's a video game rapper. He's got podcasts. He wrote a book, released a book this year. He really just drilled down on this video game. It's called nerdcore. It's like this subgenre. It's not really my thing, but he's a very talented rapper, and he's a hustler. He tours the world prior to COVID, of course. He was touring the world and really made something in that world. And I'm pretty sure he has a podcast as well. So like if you're into something, just like, I'm doing music and beer, for example, and able to lean into those two things to create something unique, and maybe people are interested, maybe they're not, but at the very least you'd be like, I get this guy, and you can understand what they have to offer. So show who you are from the beginning. A podcast is I can't think of a better way to do that in long form, to really show who you are.
And what tips would you give to if you're like about planning your podcast? So if I'm thinking about starting one, for my music, to promote my music, or to talk about music, or speak to kind of people who are in the same genre as me, how should I go about, like, how should I approach it? Like, because I think a lot of people, when they start podcasting, and this is common across the board, it doesn't matter what niche your podcast is in, is people will record like 1 or 2 episodes. And I think the stats are scary. Something like 80% of podcasts have got like under 5 episodes. So and obviously, there's like most podcasts, there's 2 million podcasts listed on Apple. They just hit 2 million this year. They just hit 1 million last year. So lots of people have been starting them during lockdown, etc. But there are tons and tons of podcasts that are just like a couple of episodes. And obviously, you're testament to the fact that consistency is key. You've got to make sure that you're being consistent. You're producing content on a regular basis. And of course, I think a lot of people think they're going to go into it and they're going to be Joe Rogan from day one. Of course, it doesn't work like that,
No.
So how would you go about, like, from a music perspective, like planning your first series, say, if you had to start all over again?
That's a great point. First thing I really think is research. I think you have to know the landscape. So I listen to a lot of music podcasts, a lot of hip hop podcasts. So I'm hearing the ones that I like. And do you know what? Even beyond just music, I listen to a ton of different podcasts, as most podcast listeners do. The breadth of your interest as a human being is pretty well represented in the podcast world. There's almost nothing, that you can't find.
Yeah, true.
Like I dare you to try and find, to not be able to find something. So if you can understand, like I say, for example, Tim Ferriss. Are you familiar with Tim Ferriss, the author?
Yes,
yeah. So he was,
Four day work week.
Absolutely. He's the reason we started our business. He's super, responsible for a lot of things. I love that dude. So he had this section on his podcast where he did this lightning round of quick questions. So I took that and I brought that to BAOS, to the beer podcast. We did that for the first 4 years, and it had ended everything like, what's your desert island beer? Like what would be, like what's the worst beer you ever made, and things like that. So I'd have like 10 questions, and I'd ask the brewers those questions inspired by Tim Ferriss. So it wasn't even through listening to other beer podcasts. So for our podcast, for the Bad Habits, the hip hop podcast, of course, I'm listening to seeing what the other ones in our genre are doing, but there's interesting things that other people are doing. So you could borrow from everything, because the last thing you want to do is be a complete copy of Rogan, which is impossible, but or somebody else and just copy their format. It's boring, it's lazy. So research and get inspired by a bunch of as many places and many things as possible, and bring your own interest in and be creative with it. I feel like what's the word? The charisma between the co-hosts. That's not the right word, but you know what I mean. Like the energy and the way that you guys
communicate. The dynamic between the two. Yeah,
that's the word. Thank you. And that is super important, I think. Yeah. And because if you're not able to communicate really, well, and you bounce off each other, it's going to make it difficult. So I think you definitely need 1 to 2 co-hosts, unless you're going to do an interview. So then you need to pick the format. Are you an interview? So I host BAOS and I interview people or exclusively. I don't do podcasts by myself. I've done it like once when I was sick, and I was just did 20-minute one talking about why you should balance your life, because I needed to do the content and I wasn't able to drink. But aside from that, I always have an interview. Even if I have my girlfriend and we just shoot the shit for an hour or something like that, that's a nice fun way around it. So on Bad Habits, though, we have 3 of us, and that dynamic, I feel like 3 is the magic number with podcast hosts.
That's interesting.
I've heard other people say that. Have you heard that before? Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure if I have. Because a lot of podcasters I speak to are just solo podcasters. They will just be them, and they will be interviewing a guest.
Okay.
Especially probably because I mainly talk to people who are like working in the entrepreneurial space, that kind of thing. A lot of solo founders. But gotcha. I agree. Like when I've been recording podcasts and there's been more than one person in the room, we have a studio, so we'll have quite often sometimes we've had like up to like 6 people in there, and especially when I've been observing those kind of conversations, they can be so much more interesting because you're just getting different perspectives, and it's not just like, sometimes there's so much pressure on you if you're just a podcast host and you're doing an interview. All the pressure's on you to ask all the interesting questions. Whereas if there's two of you and then maybe a guest, suddenly you've got like that more of a dynamic, because you can, your co-host might ask a question you hadn't thought of, and vice versa. So it's like immediately the interview becomes more interesting, because not everyone is wired the same. Not everyone thinks of the same questions.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. I think three is the magic number. That's really, really interesting advice.
Yeah.
And I guess as well, like especially a lot of musicians, if you're in a band, you get your bandmates on.
Absolutely. Particularly if you've got a rapport and you guys can bet. I'm sure if you're touring or you're in the studio, you're sort of like bouncing off each other. That's why you're in a band. So all you're doing is taking that and just recording it.
Recording some of those conversations that happen in the studio or happen backstage or whatever.
Exactly. Or just trying to recreate that magic in a more intentional way with a podcast. And it's doable as well. And even for the solo ones, another thing I do a lot for BOS, I bring in guest co-hosts. So I've got my friend Nathan, he writes our blog. He does all the blog posts. So I bring him last week, this week, and next week. We've got a bunch of podcasts, and he's co-hosting them with me. So, it allows exactly what you said. He thinks of questions that I don't know, and so on and so forth. I got a rotating, probably 3 or 4 people that I bring in as guest co-hosts to interview someone. Usually I try and make it that they have a relationship already, so it's a little smoother. In the beer world, it's pretty small, so it's easy. But I found that 3 is the night. 2 back and forth is great too, but 3 kind of just adds that little bit of spice in there.
That's really interesting, the concept of having a guest co-host or like rotating your co-host, so you have different people, talking at different times. Again, there's no reason why you can't do that. It kind of makes it fresh each time for the listener as well, because ultimately I think, again, like a lot of people will go into podcasts sometimes thinking I'm thinking about me here, whereas actually no, you've got to be thinking about who's on the other end, who's listening down those headphones, or who's listening to your podcast. So try and think about what the listener wants to hear and deliver it, and sit down with your co-host, thresh things out beforehand. Think, right, okay, what are we trying to get out of this conversation?
100%, and it's all about value. I think everything comes down to delivering value at all times.
Or entertainment.
Entertainment or value, exactly right. Like depending on what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So, or some sort of mix of both,
Yeah.
whatever you can do, but there's got to be something. You're so right. That's exactly what it is. You got to think about the listener. It's not just this fest where you guys are just hanging out doing your thing. You've got to remember that it's a piece of content that's a produced show. So that's what people sometimes, maybe they're the people who give up and aren't consistent, perhaps because they didn't figure out the format or something.
Yeah, I think so. It's just or people. I think people think about like the first couple of episodes, like they'll have these bright spot moments, and then they'll kind of get 2-3 episodes. Like about the phrase about the difficult second album.
Yes,
It's like that with podcasts. I think people have like this brainwave. They'll like record like a bunch of episodes, and then they'll sort of hit a brick wall and think, whereas if you actually spend some time like maybe mapping out your first series or season. That's kind of like what we always recommend is like don't necessarily need to burn yourself out promising to do one episode every week, 52 weeks a year. You could say do 10 episodes, have a little break, think about how you can improve for the next series and kind of like approach it like that.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and of course you can map it all out then. Okay, just to finish up, how has matchmaker.fm helped you with your podcasting journey?
It was so cool, man. I was really happy to when I received the email telling me about the service, so I signed up immediately. The idea, like I'm for what I do, I'm probably looking to be the guest as opposed to searching for guests, but because in my niche I already know enough sort of people for what I need to do. But I was even thinking there's a huge entrepreneur, like you mentioned the entrepreneur, there's a huge, from what I noticed, a lot of entrepreneur podcasts, because that's what I chose for myself to be able to get involved in that. On that side for me. So that made me, I was like, so when we do our podcast, there's going to be more in the entrepreneur social media kind of realm. It's going to be a great resource for us to be able to find guests, because that's going to be that's something I don't know many people on. Yeah. So I find that's going to be beneficial. So I submitted for a few of them. I haven't gone as hard at it as I planned to. It's just things are a little wild in my world right now. But as soon as things kind of like, you know what it's like, everything comes at once. Yeah. So, but I plan on going nuts and using it as much as possible. Awesome. I find it's just such a smart way to do it, man. It's such a great resource, and I love that you're doing that as well as doing this. It's fantastic, and you've actually built something that helps people connect in a time where it's sort of more podcasts than ever. It's something that's really, really needed. So well done, man. I think it's fantastic.
Appreciate it, Craig. All right, awesome. And just to finish up, if people want to get hold of you, find out more about you, how can they do so? Yes, sir. I'll try and keep it simple. So if you want to follow me, it's CEEFOR on Instagram and Twitter. If you want to follow the beer stuff, it's BAOS Podcast everywhere. YouTube, on all podcast networks, on all social media. For our other one, Bad Habits, it's The Movement Fam, FAM, everywhere on all social. And High Season Co. is our social media agency where we produce content on YouTube primarily, with a podcast coming soon, to help you sort of do your social media right and make sure that's working. So yeah, man, really appreciate you having me. This has been fun. I love talking about this stuff. I love it. And congrats again. Yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Cheers. Hey, so thanks very much for watching this video. I think that interview I did with Craig provided fantastic insight on what it's like to be a musician who also leverages podcasting to help grow someone's audience. Now, if you're thinking about going into podcasting either as a host or as a guest, then please check out matchmaker.fm. I know we talked about it in the interview, but I just thought I'd quickly remind you to sign up. It's free to join, and it's a fantastic place to get started in terms of actually growing your connections within the industry and getting those all-important guest appearances, or even finding guests that you can collaborate with on your show. And just before you go, if you've got any questions, please put them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Okay, take it easy. Hey, wait, before you go, perhaps you're looking to start a podcast for your business. And did you know that most businesses make the same exact mistakes? Whenever we work with clients who are struggling to get their podcast off the ground, or they're not getting the traction that they deserve, it turns out that most of the time they're making the same mistakes. So what I've done is I've compiled a guide which is called the 5-Step Business Podcast Checklist, which will show you exactly what you need to know to get your podcast up and running without making the same mistakes that most other people do. So you can download it for free at jamesm.com/podcast. That's jamesm.com/podcast. Go and grab your copy today.